Jones said, "This morning the golf course was like being in heaven at sunrise. And yes, my iPhone certainly did a poor job of capturing the awe." With that said, at my age, I'm not convinced that a slight chicken wing is a bad thing, and it's obvious that I'm having to favor a slightly torn Achilles tendon, and yet, in a goofy way, I can still get out of the bunkers. The show this evening will challenge lots of notions, but stay committed to the process, not the conclusions. I have lots of respect for George Lakoff's work. He does a great job at sharing the best explanations of the facts to anyone with an ear. And think about how he challenges people to rethink their positions on reason. Example: real reason is inexplicably tied up with emotion. You cannot be rational without being emotional. False reason thinks that emotion is the enemy of reason.
Now, to introduce Professor Lakoff, I'm going to turn over the microphone to Professor Mark Johnson. If you've ever had the privilege of listening to him speak on the philosophy of language or the philosophy of metaphor, the philosophy of cognitive science, or Immanuel Kant, you'll remember how lucky you were because of his thoughtfulness and insightfulness. In addition, he's the co-author of 2 works with George Lakoff, Metaphors We Live By, and Philosophy in the Flesh, the Embodied Mind, and its Challenge to Western Thought. Mark Johnson.
Now, you came here to hear George Lakoff and to talk with him, not to hear another introduction, so I'll be brief. Most of you know George Lakoff from his long and distinguished career as a linguist and cognitive scientist at the University of California, Berkeley, and you know him more recently as co-founder and senior fellow at the Rockridge Institute, which sadly will cease to exist in the next couple of days. You know George through his profoundly influential books and articles that, for many of us, especially for me, have changed the way we look at mind, thought, language, science, politics, religion, ethics. In his earlier books, from 1980 through the mid-90s, George led the way, I think, in bringing the newly emerging cognitive sciences into collaborative discussion with the humanities. I'm thinking of books here like Metaphors We Live By in 1980, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, What Categories Reveal About the Mind in 87, More Than Cruel Reason, A Field Guide to Poetic Metaphor in 89, Philosophy in the Flesh, The Embodied Mind and Its Challenge to Western Thought in 99, and Where Mathematics Comes From, How the Embodied Mind Brings Mathematics into Being in 2000. And of these 5 books, 4 of them are collaborative, and I think it's a tribute to him and his interdisciplinary spirit and his ability to collaborate. He sets up a kind of model for this sort of work. In this body of work, George showed how the sciences and the humanities can be mutually enlightening rather than antagonistic. He helps us appreciate the necessity of broadly interdisciplinary work if we're to develop the richest possible understanding of what it means to be human. And the question he would always ask, in my experience in working with him, after you do all this difficult work from all these different disciplines and you struggle with this, there's still the question to be asked, what difference does any of this scholarly work make for human being, for how we live our lives? And if you can't answer that, then you have to ask yourself why you're doing what you're doing. Why isn't it just a game? A little over a decade ago, this fundamental existential question took on an even greater urgency for George. In a series of highly influential books, which many of you know, he began to use his vast knowledge of sciences, of mind, to directly address moral, social, cultural, political problems of our day. This began with Moral Politics, What Conservatives Know That Liberals Don't in 1996. And it was followed by, in quick succession, Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values and Frame the Debate. Whose Freedom? The Battle Over America's Most Important Idea. Thinking Points, Communicating Our American Values and Vision. And this month, or next month, I guess, in early June, his next book is coming out, a very exciting piece, The Political Mind, why you can't understand 21st century politics with an 18th century view of mind. And I understand that they're taking advance orders at a 20% discount out in front. What I admire most about George Lakoff as a scholar and teacher is the way he's taken his breathtaking interdisciplinary studies of mind, thought, and language, and then brought them to bear on the most pressing human problems and issues: war, politics, environmental issues, freedom, democracy, economics, social welfare, religion, ethics, and much, much more, as John said. I regard George as a model of the kind of public intellectual we need today in a world that seems to have gone mad with war, greed, violence, torture, destruction of the environment, and disregard for education and social services. Everyone who's here tonight, I suspect, has come because they share this vision of the importance of putting our intellectual work into moral practice. And I regard George Lakoff as an embodiment of this ideal. So please welcome him.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you all for coming. Those of you who've had the pleasure of studying with Mark will know what a treasure you have at the University of Oregon. I've worked with Mark for nearly 30 years, and I really know what a treasure he is. I want to start with the book that's coming out. It actually is in print now, I'm told. I haven't seen it yet, but it's my publisher called and said, you'll have it by Tuesday. So it's being shipped. All right. It begins, it's actually something very different from the books I've written on politics before. Because what I tried to do there is take the amazing developments in our understanding of the brain and the mind that have occurred in the last 30 years and give a popular introduction to them by way of politics and why understanding the brain and the mind matters in every detail for our politics. And this is not something that you might expect, but by the end of tonight, I hope you'll understand it and see why it's absolutely crucial to get an understanding of what has been discovered. The structure of the book is this. It was really hard to write this book, to be honest. And the only way I could figure out to structure it was to take a common assumption, a set of assumptions about the mind that come to us from the Enlightenment. A lot of folks who study political science get a view, which is partly true, that this democracy came out of the political ideas of the Enlightenment, and that's true. However, the Enlightenment also had a view of the mind, and that has become very commonplace. And let me just go through what that view of the mind is. It starts like this. It says, reason, that is, thought, is conscious. You know, Descartes said, I think, therefore I am. I know I'm conscious, I think. It assumes that reason is dispassionate. Thinks, Star Trek and Mr. Spock, right? It assumes that reason is logical, that it works by mathematical logic, sort of, and that everybody thinks the same way around the world, and that reason can apply directly to the world, that you can reason about the world as it is directly. It also assumes that reason is universal, everybody thinks the same way, and it's disembodied, abstract. And lastly, it assumes that reason is based on self-interest, that we evolved reason to be able to satisfy our interests, right? Every part of that view is false. Every single part has been shown in the last 30 years to be false. And I grew up with that view. So it was a little shocking to me as it came along. But let me try to give you some sense of it. Virtually, the usual estimate of unconscious thought and reason is about 98% unconscious. It's what your brain is doing while your mind is busy being conscious. Most of it is not accessible, but it can be studied, and that's what we do. The last 30 years, we have lots and lots of techniques for studying how we understand the mind and what the brain is doing. And we'll go through some of that now. Is it dispassionate? Is reason dispassionate? The opposite is true. Antonio Damasio, in a groundbreaking book called Descartes' Error, showed about 10 years ago that people who have a certain kind of brain damage that keeps them from feeling emotions or understanding what other people's emotions are cannot function rationally. Why? Think for a minute. Imagine that you had such brain damage. You had no emotions and you didn't know what anyone else would feel. How would you know what to want? How would you know whether it would satisfy you or not? Well, satisfaction wouldn't mean anything. And not only that, how would you know if people would be angry with you or happy with you? You couldn't tell at all. You wouldn't know how to function at all. And people who have that form of brain damage cannot function rationally in the world. Turns out that emotion is necessary for reason, and we'll see why in a little bit. Next, does it fit the world directly? The answer is no, with a big N. And the reason is that we think in terms of what are called conceptual frames. Let me talk a little bit about what conceptual frames are, and then we'll get on to why they're important for politics. Conceptual frames were discovered in the early 1970s by three great scholars independently in three different fields within the same year. It's one of those great things that happens now and then. Irving Goffman, great sociologist, was studying institutions. And he found that every institution is structured in terms of what he called frames or roles. You think of a hospital where there are doctors and patients and orderlies and so on, or a restaurant where you have waiters and chefs and customers and so on. People serve certain roles. There are relationships between the roles, and then there are certain scenarios they carry out. In a hospital, the surgeons do the operating. The receptionists take you in and register you, and so on. So if you walk into the hospital, to the reception desk, they hand you a scalpel and say, you're operating on the surgeon on the desk over here. You've broken the frame. And that was one of the things that Goffman pointed out, that the way you tell what the frame is to ask what's impermissible. Charles Fillmore, a great linguist, looking at just language, noticed the same things. If you take words like related words, knife, fork, spoon, or Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, etc. These are what are called semantic fields, and you know that they're related in a certain way, and you can tell what's not in the field. And you don't have to get an NSF grant to do this. I give you Sunday, Monday, Apple, Tuesday, and you know which one is not in the group, right? Now, if you take words like buy, sell, cost, price, what Fillmore observed is that you understand it with respect to a frame. Namely, there's a buyer, seller, goods, and money in any commercial event. And then first, the buyer has the money, wants the goods. The seller has the goods, wants the money. They exchange. The opposite is true, and that's it. Every commercial event works that way. And every time you hear the word cost, as in that cost me $10, you know that you're talking about the goods and the money, but that there is a buyer and a seller. That's implicit in the frame. Marvin Minsky, one of the founders of artificial intelligence, came to the same conclusion. This was all around 1974, 75. We think in terms of frames, but every word is defined relative to some frame. Every word. And that's important because if you think that thought can just fit the world directly, you're going to miss that. You will think that language is neutral and just fits the world. It actually fits a conceptual framework. And what you're going to see as we go along is that not everybody has the same frames. We have very different ones, and that's an important thing to know. So that's first. It turns out that reason does not directly fit the world. It has to go through framing. But it also goes through metaphorical thought. And this is something that Mark and I stumbled on back in the late 1970s and started writing about. And since then, there's been a great deal of work on this. The most interesting of that came in the late 1990s with a neural theory of metaphor. We now have some sense of how they develop and how metaphorical thought comes about. And it apparently comes about, even before you've learned a lot of language. Metaphorical thought precedes metaphorical language, and there are a lot of what are called primary metaphors. Let me give you an example. And just simple everyday cases. More is up and less is down. Why? Prices rise, fall, etc. Why? Turns out it's not just true in English, it's true in many other languages. Not necessarily all, but you don't get the reverse. Think of it, you pour water in the glass, the level goes up every day of your life. Okay? What is happening in the brain of a child who sees this every day? In the brain, verticality is registered in one part of the brain, quantity in another. They're registered in two different parts of the brain. The child sees it, and the child doesn't know this, but the brain is being activated in two different places. Now, the same is true for, and let's take other examples of metaphors, like he's a warm person, a cold person, okay? You're held by your parents when you're a child affectionately, and there's a correlation between affection and physical temperature, warmth. Two different parts of your brain are active. The part that has to do with affection, the part that has to do with warmth. What happens when this happens over and over and over again every day? Two different parts of the brain are active, activation spreads along existing pathways. As it spreads over and over, you get stronger and stronger synapses along that pathway, those pathways, and each neuron has connections to 1,000 to 10,000 others. You get lots of spreading through the brain until there is a connection made. And at that point, you get twice the reinforcement, that is twice the change in the synapses, and a circuit is formed. That circuit is the metaphor, more is up, or affection is warmth. That is why you have certain, not all metaphors, similar around the world, because where we have similar correspondences in experience, we get similar metaphors in a lot of languages. Now, they may or may not show up in the language, but they show up in the way we understand the world. I'll give you lots of examples. I mean, I could give you hundreds, I won't. But a simple case. Purposes are destinations. They're goals you're trying to reach. That's what it means, one of the things it means to achieve a purpose, right? Why? You want a cold beer, you got to go to the fridge. Want to go to the lecture, you got to come here. But a baby who wants his blankie and it's over there, got to crawl over and get it, right? Every single day, there's a correlation between achieving a purpose and going to some destination. And then you get the metaphor via that spread. Okay, your brain is doing this. And those are elementary or primary metaphors. Complicated metaphors of the sort you get in Shakespeare and other poets and so on are combinations of these. And they're complex, interesting combinations. Those are not necessarily universal. Those can be very, very different from culture to culture. Now, so it turns out that by the time you're like 5 or 6 years old, you have learned hundreds of primary metaphors just by living in the world. Just by going around every day where two different parts of your experience are correlated and they affect your brain and you learn those and you don't know they're there. They're part of the cognitive unconscious. And we'll see in a minute that this affects your understanding of morality and politics in a deep way. We'll get to there. So one reason is not just fitting the world. It's fitting metaphors and it's fitting frames. It's also not just working by mathematical logic, because Metaphors and frames don't just work by mathematical logic. And in addition to that, these ideas, these frames and metaphors are embodied. After all, think what we just said about more and up. You're living in the world, you have an embodied experience. Your whole metaphor system is based on your embodied experience, but it's deeper even than that. There's a remarkable set of discoveries made beginning around 1990. The first that I knew of was by Martha Farah at Penn. And what she discovered was this. She found that if you take people who are doing visual imagination experiments, they were learning a picture. You do a drawing of a treasure island or something like that, where there is a port and a palm tree and a treasure and a house and stuff like this. And you have them memorize this and until they can get it really, really right. Then you put them in a brain scanner, and you say, okay, now imagine this. You do an experiment where they walk from here to here and here, from one place to another. What is activated in their brains? The visual system down to the primary visual cortex. A good part, not all of this, but a good part of what is active in the brain when you see is active in the brain when you imagine seeing. And the same when you remember seeing, and the same when you dream about seeing, and the same when you hear words about seeing. Similarly, if you're acting, you're moving in the world, it turns out if you're imagining moving, that part of the brain is active. So you check with the brain scanner and you say, okay, now you're imagining running. What's lighting up? The part that has to do with your feet. You're imagining grasping something, the part that has to do with your hand. You're biting something, the part that has to do with your mouth. And it's also true if you remember doing it, if you dream about doing it, and if you use language, like biting an apple versus grasping an apple versus kicking an apple. Different parts of your brain will be active. Okay? In short, that's how meaning arises. Think about it this way. If I give you a sentence like, Harry drank a glass of water. If you can't even imagine what it would mean to drink a glass of water, you don't understand the sentence. To understand the sentence, you have to at least be able to simulate it in your brain. And that's what understanding concrete sentences is about. And the abstract ones have to do with metaphorical projections of those. You have the metaphor system you already have. Now, that is remarkable. We understand something about meaning, but it isn't what people thought. It isn't words fitting the world in itself. It has to do with the way you understand the world given the brains and bodies that we have, and that is remarkable. So now we have a very different picture of reason, and it's not disembodied, it's not floating out in space. It has to do with your physical body. Every single idea that you have is physically in your brain. Every time you learn a new word, that word is defined with respect to some frame, and that frame is physically in your brain. And then you say, well, what does it mean for a frame to be physically in your brain? And one of the nice things about being at a major university is there are people who figure out these things. I've been working for the last 20 years with Jerry Feldman at Berkeley at the International Computer Science Institute on the Neural Theory of Language and Thought project. And he has a terrific book called From Molecules to Metaphors, where he explains the kinds of circuitry and the kinds of neural computation needed to give you frames, metaphors, and so on. That is, we know, if not, we can't go down and see the actual circuits, but we know what their properties would have to be. Now, given that, there's another very important question. Is our reason dedicated to our interests? Is it there for self-interest? Well, there's another great discovery in neuroscience that occurred in 1996 in Parma, Italy, justifiably famous for Parmesan cheese and prosciutto di Parma, but also for mirror neurons, M-I-R-R-O-R. Let me explain a little bit about it. In that laboratory, they were doing studies of macaque monkeys, and they had a remarkable apparatus set up. And in that apparatus, they had the monkeys, a probe inserted in the monkey's brain with microprobes that could register when any single neuron was fired. And they were looking at the premotor cortex, which is does coordinations of complex actions like that, as opposed to simple actions like this, which are done in the motor cortex. And they had trained the monkey to do things like peel bananas and press buttons and grab rings and things of this sort. And they would go and they would check neuron by neuron which neurons were firing. And they would have a computer there hooked up to it to register exactly which neurons were firing when. And at one point, the experimenter took a break. I know that I've since met the guy, he's become a friend. He took a break and for lunch, came back, there was a pile of bananas, so he picked up a banana, started to peel it, and he heard click, 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 click from the computer. But it was hooked up to the monkey, not him. Turns out that these neurons fire when either you perform an action or you see someone else perform the same action. That's why they're called mirror neurons. Well, it turns out they're very interesting because that part of the brain is also tied to the emotional regions via circuitry. And we know that there is a neurophysiology of emotion. You know, that is, if you're happy, you smile, and if you're sad, you droop, and if you're angry, you bare your teeth, and so on, which is why you can tell what someone else is feeling. This is the physiological basis of empathy. We are born hardwired for empathy, to feel what someone else feels. And it turns out they fire more if you're cooperating. We are hardwired for empathy and cooperation, not just for self-interest. Remarkable, terrifically important fact about what it means to be a moral person. And we'll get to that in a minute. So it's important to see that this view of the mind as conscious, logical, literal, fitting the world directly, unemotional, disembodied, and self-interested is utterly false. And then the question is, why does it matter? Well, it turns out that most economic theories are based on this thing called the rational actor model. And cognitive scientists of various sorts have shown that there are many problems with this. For example, Danny Kahneman actually won a Nobel Prize in economics, though he's a cognitive scientist, not an economist, for showing that frames and metaphors and so on apply in economic reasoning. Right? It's not that way. It turns out to matter for foreign policy, because if you take a course in international relations theory, they will teach you about the rational actor model, assuming that states all act according to this model. They don't. That's important to know. Okay? So that's the least of it, but it's true and important. But it's important in other ways, because if you believe, suppose you believe this view of reason, what would you think about language? You would think language was neutral. You would think language just fit the world. You wouldn't know about the frames and the metaphors and so on. And so what would happen if conservatives happened to frame the issues in public discourse their way, and you didn't know about framing, that it was natural and normal, that their words were fitting their frames, their ways of understanding the world, you know, you would just accept them. If you were a journalist trained in the rational act, in this notion of rationality, you would just accept it. And not only that, suppose someone came along and told you about framing, you would think that this was just political spin. You would think that this was a way of fooling people, right? And that is a big mistake. It turns out you cannot tell the truth about anything without framing it properly. Let me give you examples from politics. And this is a problem for progressives and Democrats. One of the problems you will see over and over in democratic discourse is the following. People will give you the facts and the figures as an argument. There are 47 million people without health care. So, all right, well, what does this mean to a conservative? Rudy Giuliani said, that's too bad, they haven't earned it. They should go out, get a job, and earn enough to get their health care. After all, he said, health care is just a consumer product, like flat-screen TVs. Yes, he said, health care is like flat-screen TVs. It should be done only by the market. With flat-screen TVs, you sell a lot of them, the prices go down. Why, you would save money on health care that way. Right? Wrong. Right? Healthcare is not exactly like flat-screen TVs. You know, I don't have a flat-screen TV, and a lot of people, if they don't have flat-screen TVs, don't die. But more than that, let's take the example of healthcare as opposed to health insurance, because it's very important to understand the framing of the healthcare debate. And then we'll come back to understanding why it's framed in this way. Health care is not coverage. Coverage is not care. You have all kinds of health insurance, and you go to your HMO, and they find reasons not to give you care. Right? If you've seen Michael Moore's movie, you understand it from Sicko, but most of you will understand it from Life. All right? It turns out that the reason that there's a lot of administrative costs vary from 15 to 30% in HMOs, plus profit above that. The reason is that they try to find reasons to deny you care. And that's how HMOs make profit. They make profit by insuring people who are already healthy or denying care. That is, they make their profit by not giving care. The more less care they give, the more profit they make, right? Now, is this a market phenomenon? The answer is no. It is the opposite of a market phenomenon. It is an anti-market phenomenon for the following reason. In a market, the company that delivers the most product makes the most profit. In health insurance, the company that delivers the least product makes the most profit. In a market, the more competition you have, the better it is for consumers. But with healthcare, the more competition you have, the competition is about investors who want to make the most profit. And they make the most profit when the companies give the least care. Therefore, the more competition there is, the least care product you're going to get. It's an anti-market phenomenon. It's the reverse of how a market's supposed to work, right? So one of the most interesting things is this, right? Now, have you heard this in the healthcare debates? Of all of the discussion of healthcare? Never discussed. With all that verbiage, never discussed. All right? Now, where is it discussed? It's discussed under what is named very badly, single-payer healthcare. Terrible name. What is single-payer about? It is about patient-centered care. Under such a system, what happens is that your care is determined by your doctor and you, period. That any government agency, or most likely a trust, not the government itself, but a trust set up, would collect the money and be like a bank and then disperse it. And the costs would be determined by regional councils of healthcare professionals, economists, and so on. So that what happens under a patient-centered care is the only administrative cost, as with Medicare, would be 3%, very, very small. No profit costs. There's enough money left over from what's already being paid to cover everybody. And not only that, nobody's there to deny you care. Your care is determined by you and your doctor. Have you heard that before? Did anybody ever tell you what this was, this thing called single payer? That's what it is. Bill 676, House Bill 676 in Congress. And people trying to defeat it are not just Republicans, but many Democrats, for reasons we'll get to. Okay? Now, it's very important to know that the truth must be framed, which is what I just did. I just didn't call it single-payer care. I didn't give it just some verbiage. I framed it for you in terms of that you can understand what it really is about. I distinguished between care and insurance, which you don't get right now in any of the discussions. In order to tell the truth, you must frame, because that's the only way that people will understand it and grasp it. Okay? Now, why is it that this isn't out there? Why is it that we have these and various other false views of the world floating around in public discourse? It's not an accident, it's by plan. In 1971, Lewis Powell, before he went on to the Supreme Court, Nixon's Supreme Court, wrote a memo for the National Chamber of Commerce, which you can get on the internet by putting into Google Lewis Powell memo. And basically what Powell said was this. 1971, height of the Vietnam War. A terrible thing is happening. The best and brightest of our students don't want to be conservative businessmen. This is awful. We have to do something about this. What we have to do is get wealthy conservatives to fund conservative business professorships in major universities, to set up institutes in major universities, but we can't trust the universities. We have to set up our own research institutes, get the best scholars we can get, pay them well, and get them research assistants, the best research assistants they can get, pay them well, set up magazines and journals where they can publish, and buy media to get their words out. Right? 1971. Now there are over 80 such conservative institutions. The amount spent on them is about $400 million a year. The total spent is over $4 billion over that period. And what they do is they take the ideas of conservatism and apply them everywhere. Nothing like this was done by progressives. The progressives about 4 or 5 years ago figured out finally that this was happening, and then they set up the opposite kinds of think tanks. That is, they set up things like the Center for American Progress, filled with very, very good people who were doing issue-by-issue research and never getting to what progressive ideas were about. They were doing, foreign policy or military policy or health policy or something or other, but never progressive policy, never progressive ideas, never getting them out there. The conservatives spent money on training institutes. The major institute, Leadership Institute in Virginia, trains tens of thousands of people a year. A year. We don't have it. We don't have people trained to talk about how to think about these things. What you have is basically anti-intellectualism on the progressive side. The conservatives value their intellectuals and pay them well. Right? This is not true of people in progressive politics. They set up policy institutes, and those policy institutes have a certain mode of thought. It's called Enlightenment reason and the rational actor model. Every policy institute runs that way. Okay? Think about that for a moment. It turns out that the brain does matter for who is making up your policies and how they're doing it. Now, what has come out of this is that on the most important ideas that we can have, the conservatives have gotten their versions into the public. And what are those ideas? The idea of what government itself is, the idea of what morality is, the idea of what security is, what taxes are, what responsibility is, what character is, and what life is. All of it, and more and more. Fundamental ideas are out there and repeated over and over by the right. When do you generally hear progressives talking at that level? You don't. And that's terrible. Because progressives have an understanding at that level, and it is part of the cognitive unconscious. If you talk to progressives, it's very simple to see what this is. And let me tell you how I got at this and why it's a cognitive science problem. The history, in my own history, it came about this way. In 1992, I was watching the Republican National Convention that summer out of a sense of civic duty. And I really wanted to hear what Dan Quayle had to say. Because his speech was written by William Kristol, a major conservative theorist. And I'd been following William Kristol. I wanted to hear what Kristol was going to write. So I sat there listening to Dan Quayle in my living room, and I got a deep sense of embarrassment because I did not understand Dan Quayle. I understood every word and every sentence. That wasn't the problem. I had no idea how those sentences fit together or what they meant. So I tried to remember at least one. I'm a linguist, that's what we do, you know. Okay, here's one. Dan Quayle's argument against the progressive income tax was one sentence. Why should the best people be punished? Everybody there claps and they applaud, they wave their signs, cheering, and I don't get it, right? Now, this is my field. I don't get it. This is embarrassing. 2 years later, I'm reading 1994. I come about, I duly go down to my local independent bookstore and buy a copy of The Contract with America. And then I really get puzzled. And I say, look, here are these people who are promising certain things. What are they promising? They're going to get rid of abortion and they're going to institute a flat tax. What does a flat tax have to do with abortion? Not only that, they're going to get rid of environmental regulations. What does that have to do with the flat tax? And they're going to make sure you can own machine guns. What does that have to do with getting rid of environmental regulations? And not only that, they're going to have tort reform. What does that have to do with machine guns? I didn't get it. So I said, look, I have the opposite views on all of these things. How do my views fit together? I had no answer. I didn't have a way to explain it. But I knew one thing. This is a cognitive science problem. It's in my field. So dutifully, I started research. And so I went out and I interviewed liberals and conservatives as much as I could. I took down people's speeches. I took things out of the newspapers, every argument I could find, every use of language. For several months I did this. I got nowhere until I remembered that a student in my class had written a remarkable little 4-page homework paper on the fact that we have a metaphor of the nation as family. We have founding fathers. Every second grader knows that George Washington is the father of his country and doesn't say, "What do you mean? It's not Daddy." Right? We have the Daughters of the American Revolution. We have Homeland Security. Right? And it's not just here. There's Mother Russia, Mother India, the fatherland. It's all over the world. So why should we have a metaphor of the nation as a family, and what's going on? Okay, now more recently, that was in 1994. In 1997, this neural theory of metaphor was figured out, and I came to understand it better. And it goes like this. It's actually more general than the nation as family. Why? Think of it this way in terms of your experience. What is your earliest experience with governance? In your family. Or, you have your family members in one part of your brain, you recognize them, and they're telling you what to do in another part of the brain, and taking care of you, and setting up stuff for you, and governing your life. What you learn as a result is a metaphor that a governing institution is a family. And the nation is one example, but it could be at any level, and it could be the church, or a little league team, or a business, or all kinds of other governing institutions. But the nation is one natural one. Now, I then, looking at that, I said, hey, if we have two different models for how the nation should run, maybe there are two different models of the family. Okay? So I took the, knowing something about metaphors can be written down almost like mathematical equations. You just write them straight down. They're called mappings. And you put in the facts about the politics, and you work backwards, and out pop two models of the family, a strict father family and a nurturing parent family. And each of them has a major mode of thought. Each of them has a mode of morality built in. And this is common in America. And when I noticed this, I'll tell you about it in a minute, I first went out and I gave a linguistics lecture on this to 500 cognitive linguists, okay, in Albuquerque. And sitting in the back of the room, like up there, were two friends of mine who were in the Christian Coalition, whispering to each other. And after the lecture, they came down and there was a party in somebody's backyard, and they pulled me over. I was drinking a beer, and they weren't. And they said, hey, look, this strict father family, it's pretty much right, but you have to fix it up here, and you really need to change it there. They were very, very helpful about this. I mean, they're good linguists and very smart, nice people who I like very much. They're friends and good friends. And then they said, but you should know all this. Don't you read Dobson? I said, who? I said, James Dobson. You must be from Berkeley. Yeah. Well, he's, more radio stations than anyone else. He runs this thing called Focus on the Family. It's in more newspapers than anyone else. He has so many people writing in for his stuff that he needs his own zip code. So many people working for him, he has his own freeway entrance. Oh. Gee, I hadn't seen him down in our local bookstore on Telegraph and Cody's. And he said, no, he wouldn't be there. He'd be in your local Christian bookstore. Oh, I'm from Berkeley. Said, even in Berkeley, just walk down Telegraph 5 blocks, turn right, you will see the Jews for Jesus bookstore. So I get out my dark glasses and my trench coat, take a bag for a plain brown wrapper, and go down there, and there is Dobson's classic, Dare to Discipline, and other classic works on right-wing child rearing. Here's what comes out of it. And it's pretty much exactly what I found when I went backwards from the politics to the family model. In the strict father family, it works like this. You need a strict father because there's evil in the world, and he's got to protect the family from evil, and mommy can't do it. You need a strict father because there's competition in the world, and if he's going to support his family, he's got to win those competitions, and mommy can't do it. You need a strict father because kids are born bad. They're born bad, and they just do what they want to do. They don't know right from wrong. The strict father knows right from wrong, and he has to teach the kids right from wrong, and there's only one way: punishment when they do wrong, and maybe reward when they do right. But punishment when they do wrong. And then Dobson is very clear. The punishment must be painful enough so that the child will want to avoid doing wrong and do right. Through physical discipline, the child will learn internal discipline, and that's the only way the child will become moral. Now, it turns out when you read a bunch of these books, it turns out Dobson's a liberal relative to the rest. Because he says, very clearly, there is no excuse for ever hitting a child below the age of 15 months. The other books say start from birth. Okay? Now, but notice, and Dobson then says, but of course you want to love your child. This is an act of love. And when the child does right, you want to show love. When the child does wrong, you must punish, and that's an act of love. You say, I'm punishing you because I love you. All right? Now, in addition to that, there's another wonderful secondary effect, because if the child learns the discipline of obedience, then they can go out into the market and become prosperous using that discipline. So there's a logic here. What happens if you're not prosperous? It means you're not disciplined enough to be prosperous. But if you're not disciplined, you can't be moral, so you deserve your poverty. You've heard this before? Right? What does it mean about social programs? Social programs give people things they haven't earned. They take away their discipline. That means both their capacity to earn a living and their capacity to be moral. They're doubly immoral. Okay? Now, you take this and you apply it. This is a mode of thought, and it's a mode of morality. And it comes from the moral idea of that morality is obedience to a legitimate authority. And that to be obedient and to have order, you must have discipline. Discipline is a prerequisite for order and for morality. Right? These are crucial things in conservative thought. And then you apply it everywhere. Because remember, the metaphor is not just about the nation. It's about any governing institution. So what are some of the governing institutions? Let's start with the church. Right? What does this say about God? It says God is a strict father. Right? It's a view in conservative Christianity, as opposed to progressive Christianity, which says God is a strict father. You follow my commandments, you go to heaven. You don't, you go to hell. Well, I'll give you a second chance. You can be born again. Now you follow my commandments, you go to heaven. Okay? Now, okay? Very different from progressive Christianity, which we'll talk about in a minute. You apply it to the market. What does it say? It says the market is the legitimate authority itself. And there's no higher authority, and it's natural and it's moral. So the idea of in the market you're supposed to seek to maximize your own profit, that idea is, supreme. And it's wrong to interfere with it. Now, what kind of interference do you get? 4 kinds. 1, regulation. 2, taxation, takes away profits. 3, unionization, takes away profits, worker rights. 4, tort cases, that is, civil justice system where you can sue companies who do harm to the public, takes away profits. Okay? Those are the 4 things that conservatives want to get rid of with respect to the market. There's a logic here. The form of reasoning that comes out of a strict father family via metaphor is projected onto religion, onto the market, and foreign policy. Okay? Who's the decider? It's onto the way government itself is run. Who's the moral authority in the world? Why, America. What does that say about other countries? They should do what we say, or else punishment. Right? In short, when you start applying these set of principles, which show up in the family metaphorically to other domains, what you get is radical conservatism. Radical conservatism. It's a mode of thought. Now, I'm not saying all conservatives only think this way. We're going to come back to that in a minute. But what's the other model of the family? It's what I call a nurturant parent family, and it goes like this. It says that you have 2 parents, and they're equal, and their job is to nurture their child and to raise their child to nurture others, to care about others. What is nurturance? 2 things. Empathy, you care about your child. You have to know what all those cries mean. 2, responsibility, you have to take care of the child. You don't just let them do whatever they want because they could hurt themselves. You have to tell them, how to do things right, and you have to answer their questions. You have to tell them why. All right? So responsibility and empathy are the basis of this. And then you have various other parts of family life that follow from that. Namely, you want kids to be fulfilled in life, you want them to be happy in life, you want them to be, to learn to be socially responsible because you raise them to be nurturing toward others and so on. That is, you raise children utterly differently. And when kids do wrong, what do? What you want to do is get them to do something to make up for it. Clean their room, just do something to make up for what you've done. You don't just beat them up. Okay? Now, very different idea. How do parents get authority in this way? By being models, by being nurturant, by being a legitimate authority, by actually protecting the child, by actually empowering the child, by answering those questions, by caring. That's the way that you earn authority in a nurturing system. Now, you apply this to politics and to the market and to religion, and you get totally different responses. So, what is God in a progressive perspective? God is a nurturing parent. And you have love and forgiveness and healing the sick and taking care of the poor and so on. Very different view. What happens when you apply it to the market? Well, the market is there so that human beings will thrive. The market is there for the common good. Regulation is part of the definition of a market, right? Consider this. You have a prescription drug market, but you don't have a hallucinogenic drug market. Society has decided one is for the common good and the other isn't. But again, markets are, and then drug testing is supposed to be done as part of regulation. Okay? So the idea is regulation is part of the definition of markets. Very different from the other view. What is the role of government under this view? The role of government is 2 things, protection and empowerment. And I don't mean just military protection. I mean worker protection, consumer protection, safety nets, environmental protection, should be healthcare. What is empowerment? Well, you don't just build roads and systems of communication, satellite systems, internet, and so on. But you also have a banking system upheld by the federal government, a stock market, upheld by the federal government, a judicial system, mostly for corporate law, upheld by the government. Okay? Nobody can earn a dime in the country without protection and empowerment by the government. What is taxation under this view? Taxation is what you pay to live in a country that has protection and empowerment. You live here and not in Bangladesh or Chad or countries that don't have that. And that's what taxes are about. Moreover, protection and empowerment are about freedom from a progressive point of view. There are two kinds of freedom, freedom from and freedom to. Freedom from is freedom from harm. That's protection. Freedom to is freedom to fulfill yourself in life. That's empowerment. From a progressive point of view, government is about those two kinds of freedom. And taxes are what you pay to be free. Ever heard that said before in a political campaign? I mean, maybe you don't believe a word of it, but I don't think so. That understanding is implicit in progressive thought, but not said. And we have to say it out loud, because every progressive program is about it. It doesn't matter what, it's going to show up one place or another wherever you go. Now, let's take a question of framing again, because these ideas, the deep ideas that conservatives have gotten out there, what is government? You've seen their idea. It's very, very different from ours. What is the market? Very different. What are taxes? Very different. What is security? Security is military security. It's what the army is engaged in, or the paramilitary forces, or the Homeland Security Department, where you spy on people. That's seen as security, not healthcare, not worker protections and environmental protections. Those are the real securities. Those are the securities of your home. So, very important to know the difference between progressive and conservative thought. It's a huge, huge difference. And what's interesting is we all have both models. And this is something very important, and there's a reason in your brain that tells you why. First, how do you know we all have both models? Right? Suppose you are nurturant in every part of your life. You can walk into an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie and understand it. If you understand it, if you don't just walk out saying, what was that about? You see a John Wayne movie and you don't say, I didn't get it. Nobody says that. You at least have a strict father model for understanding culture. Okay? And there are a lot of people in this country who have both models in different parts of their lives. People who are conservative about economics and progressive on social issues, or conservative about foreign policy and progressive on domestic policy, or the converse. All kinds of mixtures, and there's no linear line between conservative and progressive. And you can see this in a very simple case. Compare Joseph Lieberman and Chuck Hagel. Chuck Hagel, a conservative on everything except the war. Lieberman, liberal on many things, but conservative on the war. They share virtually nothing in common. They're both called moderates. There is no moderate worldview. It's a combination of the other two. But why should this happen? It turns out brains are structured to permit it. We have in our brains what are circuitry called mutual inhibitory circuitry. Circuitry so that when one part is active, the other is inactive. Okay? So that, imagine you've seen these what are called Necker cubes, where you have a drawing of a two-dimensional drawing of a cube, and sometimes one face pops out and another face pops out, but not both at once. They sort of go back and forth. That's because of mutual inhibition. Your brain allows one, but not the other. Swing voters are that way. And what you want to do in an election is activate in swing voters your worldview. Okay? So now let's take the election that you're now looking at. A very interesting election, day by day. you have two candidates in the Democratic primary, Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, who, according to the New York Times is a wild, strange paper. It came out supporting Hillary Clinton on the following grounds: that Barack Obama had nothing but empty verbiage, had nothing to say, but he had the same positions as Hillary Clinton, but she had more experience. I didn't follow that. Anyway, what's interesting about this is they are actually opposites in a deep way. As when you look at it from the point of view of cognitive science, they're totally different in the way they would govern. And they're different in a very important way. Ronald Reagan learned something very important. I had the pleasure of talking to Reagan's chief strategist a while back. And this is Dick Wirthlin, who is now retired in his 80s, very proud of what he accomplished. And I happened to meet him at a conference. I invited him to lunch and asked him, what was it like being Reagan's chief strategist? And he said, well, we accomplished a lot. It was quite wonderful, but it wasn't always easy. When I started out, he said, I had gone to Berkeley and I had learned how to do polling there. And I had learned at Berkeley that people vote for candidates on the basis of their positions on issues. I did my first poll for Reagan. Nobody liked his positions on issues, and everybody wanted to vote for Reagan. So here I was, the chief strategist. I had no idea why anyone wanted to vote for my candidate. But I went out and I did surveys, focus groups, etc., and I soon figured it out. Reagan talked about values, and people cared about values. And if he talked about an issue, it was to illustrate a value. Reagan was authentic, or people believed that he said exactly what he believed. Authenticity matters. If somebody has values that you know, and they say what you believe, you can trust them. You may not agree with them, but you know where they stand, you can trust them. And he communicated, he connected, and so when people connect with you, you can identify with them. So we set up the campaign not on the basis of issues, but on the basis of values, authenticity, trust, communication, and identity. And in those debates, when I watched the debates with Carter and Mondale, I thought Carter and Mondale mopped the floor with Reagan. And then Reagan won. And I didn't get it. The debates were not about the issues. They were about values, authenticity, trust, identity. And that's a difference you see in this election. Hillary is running on lists of issues. Barack is running on trust, on values, on identity, on communication. Not that he doesn't have all the issues. They're running on totally different grounds. Right? That's the first part. Now, they also both say that they're bipartisan, but they're bipartisan in opposite ways. Let me explain. When Hillary says she's bipartisan, Hillary believes that there really is a center, and that to get anything done, you have to move to the right. You have to adopt conservative views, right, to compromise. Obama believes the opposite. He says, if you look at people who call themselves conservatives, they have lots of progressive views as well. They're biconceptual. They have both. And you want to find the conservatives who agree with you on those views so you don't have to adopt conservative positions. Right? And there's a lot of this. I mean, for example, why is it that you have Democrats running Montana? Think of it. What did Schweitzer understand? What did, very straightforward thing. He understood that there are people there who consider themselves conservatives, socially and various other ways, but who have progressive views. For example, they love the land. Most conservatives love the land. They would never think of themselves as environmentalists. They would never talk about wetlands. They talk about swamps. But they love the land. right? You go to the Midwest and the West, and you talk to conservatives. I lived in the Midwest for some years. Went to grad school there and taught there for a while, and in small Midwestern towns. And you find honest, progressive business people. What's a progressive businessman? Somebody who runs a business honestly, who treats his employees well, and would never harm the public. All through the Midwest, you find lots of small business people who are like this. And they consider themselves conservatives, but they're progressive business people. All through the Midwest and the South and the West, you have progressive Christians who believe that God is a nurturing parent, right? And that's what Obama understood when he won Southern Illinois, which is like the South, by like 80% of the vote. And that's what he does. It's the opposite of what Hillary does, right? Utterly different ideas. Then there's something else. The basis of progressive thought is empathy, caring about other people and acting responsibly on that care. And that takes strength, it takes endurance to do that. That's what progressive thought is about. And that's what this country was founded on. The country was founded on the idea that we as citizens have to care about each other, and the instrument of that care is government. That's how we care about each other, through the way we govern each other. We govern our country. Now, this idea is actually there in Obama's speeches, whereas the opposite idea, that this is about interests, is there in Hillary's speeches. Hillary's constantly talking about interests, all the time. Interests, interests, interests. Obama talks about the empathy deficit. If you go listen to his Selma speech, all about the empathy deficit. You go listen to the speech about race, and it's a very interesting thing. There's a line in there where he says, what is this country about? It's about freedom. It's about fairness. It's about caring. It's about prosperity. Caring, in that list. The next day, he's interviewed on CNN by Anderson Cooper. And I happened to turn it on the TV. I happened to be there at the right time, and Anderson asks him, what is the difference between your idea of patriotism and John McCain's? You know, what do you think patriotism is? And he says, patriotism starts with people caring about each other. And then he goes on to all the other values. The week later, he's on NBC in the morning with Ann Curry. And Ann Curry asks him, what's the most important thing that your mother taught you? Typical Ann Curry question, right? But it's to a presidential candidate. And his answer is empathy. Putting yourself in someone else's shoes is the most important thing that a president can do. Okay? Different from the idea of interests. And empathy, we learn from mirror neurons, is built in to us. That capacity is there. It turns out that this is important. And I think it's important right now for what's going on in the presidential race. Right now, what you're getting on the TV is the results of polls of a certain kind. And there's certain things that you hear over and over if you're listening this week. It changes week by week, but this week, it's Obama can't get votes from the white working class, nor from women, nor from voters over 40. Okay? Now, you listen to this, and by the way, somebody brought this up, of course, immediately in a course I'm teaching. And I said, okay, well, what does this mean? You hear this, how do you understand this? Okay? Now, first, why those categories? Where did they come from? Well, they come from the pollsters. Well, where did the pollsters get them? Why did the pollsters use those categories? You know, why didn't they use some random categories? The answer is the census. It's the easiest place to get categories. Pollsters are lazy. They take the categories that are there. Okay? So there you have, they take census categories. Now, they say, okay, what happens in Pennsylvania? Well, in Pennsylvania, if you look at and you break down, there are lots of census categories you could have taken. But if you break it down, there is a certain sort of micro part of this category where Hillary gets more votes than Obama in Pennsylvania, and that is white working class. Well, how many more? About 8 or 9%. Is that the way you understand it? Is it reported that in Pennsylvania, that Pennsylvanians who are white working class go 8 or 9% more? You don't hear that. You hear, they're not voting for him, as if it's 100%. Right? And also, you don't hear any reason for it. And the same thing with people over 40. Like, nobody over 40 is voting for Obama. Come on. You know? And as if the categories don't overlap. You know? There are no women over 40 who are working and, and white. Right? You just think about what you're hearing. Right? Now, the next thing is, why are they saying that, and what do you get? Like, for example, suppose you heard that the pollsters had discovered that more people who have moles on their left arm voted for Hillary in Pennsylvania. So what? Nothing. If you hear white working class, you use a frame. And that frame says the following. It says the reason they're not voting for him is they either don't identify with him or he doesn't serve their interests. Right? So here you have a difference in demography in Pennsylvania. Now it turns out that in Wyoming, the white working class overwhelmingly voted for Obama, as they did in many other states. Is that what you hear? No, it's only Pennsylvania. Because that's the last election, not the ones before it. And so what is the effect of this on the voters in Indiana who hear on TV that white working class people are not voting for Obama? They say, well, I'm white working class, maybe I shouldn't, right? Think about framing. Think about the way brains work, even the brains of pollsters. Right? Now, so that's first thing. So here you have, and notice who is repeating this over and over. Hillary. Why is Hillary doing this? Who was Hillary's just fired chief strategist? Mark Penn. What book did Mark Penn write? Microtrends. What are microtrends about? Carving up the electorate into white working class people in Pennsylvania, et cetera, et cetera. You carve it up. Now, it's not just that. It's also the fact that Hillary works in terms of interest group politics. What is interest group politics about? It's picking a microtrend, some area, where there's some part of the population that has been ill-served either by the market or government, and then say, we're going to have a government program just for you. So she goes to Pennsylvania, people have lost their jobs, and says, I have proposed a $2 billion job training program just for you, right? Et cetera. Another one. And this is what the Clinton administration did. It put together lots and lots of little interest groups, which didn't add up to a progressive vision at all.